Hello and greetings to everyone who's joined us for this webinar today. Good morning and good afternoon, good evening. We have quite a few people who have joined from all over the world, so we're very pleased to see interest in this topic and are very much looking forward to the discussion. Today we will discuss the key findings from a new report that was just launched today on financing water supply, sanitation, and flood protection, challenges in EU member states and policy options. My name is Kathleen Dominique and I work in the OECD Environment Directorate as part of the team who works on resilience, adaptation, and water, and I'm pleased to be able to moderate this discussion today. We will have our lead speakers giving a presentation shortly, and then we will have around a half an hour for Q&A. And we certainly encourage questions from you, and we ask you to use the chat function in Zoom to submit your questions. You don't have to wait until we get to the Q&A segment, but go ahead and start submitting them when they come to mind during the presentation. So just to give a few words to kick off and before we turn it over to our lead speakers, just give you a little bit of background and context on this report that was launched today. It's the result of 2 years of collaboration between the OECD and the European Commission, DG Environment, in close collaboration with EU member states. The analysis builds on new data on current levels of expenditure for water supply, sanitation, and flood protection, as well as on projected investment needs into the future. The analysis finds that most EU member states will need to increase annual expenditures for water supply and sanitation by more than 25% in order to comply with the EU acquis on water. This includes the drinking water and urban wastewater treatment directives. Some countries are better placed than others to achieve that level of ambition. And these are some of the issues that we're going to discuss in this webinar today. Today, we're going to explore 2 core questions. One is, what is the scale of the financing challenge in EU member states? And 2, what options are available to make best use of existing financial resources, minimize future financing needs, or harness additional sources of finance? And to explore those issues, I'm pleased to introduce our 2 speakers, Xavier Leflevre and Michel Sponard. And if you allow me, I'd like to just give a few, a little bit of background on both of their bios. Xavier leads the team that works on resilience, adaptation, and water in the OECD Environment Directorate. The team's work focuses on sharing best international practice for the design, implementation, and financing of policies that contribute to managing water for sustainable development and to enhance resilience and adaptation to climate change in OECD and developing countries. Michel Sponard is the acting head of unit at the European Commission, DG for the Environment. He leads a team dealing with marine environment and water industry, which is involved in projects such as the revision of the Drinking Water Directorate, the review of the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directorate, and of the Bathing Water Directorate, and the implementation of the Marine Strategy Framework Directorate. He was directly involved in the cooperation with the OECD on the assessment of investment needs and financing opportunities, so this report directly. As I mentioned, the presentation from Xavier and Michel will be followed by Q&A, so please don't hesitate to start sharing your questions via the chat function. And without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to Michel and then to Xavier for their presentation. Michel, the floor is yours. And you just have to, yeah, there you go.
It's okay? Okay, thank you, Kathleen, and good afternoon to everybody. So, as Kathleen introduced, I'm working in the European Commission. So probably I would like to just say a few words about our role in the European context. We are indeed in charge of developing European directives, and these directives are quite important because they are, in fact, at the source of the European legislation for our member states, the 27 member states. So around 60% of the environmental legislation in the European Union is coming from European directive or European regulation. We have a double role, which is first to promote or to come with new initiative a new European legislation, which then are discussed in the Parliament and in the Council. So last year, for instance, we have adopted the new and the revised directive on drinking water with new standards for drinking water, but also an important chapter on access to water. And then we have another role of making sure that this legislation are well applied by the member states. That's a role of so-called guardian of the treaty. So in that context, we are also launching, when necessary, infringement case against member states not implementing our legislation. I'm mentioning that because it's important to understand that for the origin of this study, which we were extremely pleased to lead and to co-lead with OECD, it was really a fruitful cooperation, at least from our point of view, because we are completely conscious that several member states have difficulties to implement the existing legislation in the water sector, but also that there are a lot of investment needs in the future in the water field. And that's why we were thinking that we need a solid, very solid assessment of what are the investment needs for the future. And who else than OECD? We could have asked to a consulting team, but we were thinking that for having this solid assessment, a dialogue with OECD was really important. But also at the end, if we have a label of the OECD on the data that we have generated together, for us, it's a clear added value because it gives a lot of credibility to the whole process. We were also very interested in the financing strategy of the member states, and this study has highlighted how the member states have managed to finance the investment needs in the water sector. But the study also highlights some challenge for the future, and I will come back on that a little bit later because Xavier will present a lot of results from the study now, and I will come back later to explain how we have used concretely the result of this study. One of our initial objectives was also to attract the attention of the policymaker on the investment needs. It's probably a sector where everybody thinks that everything is in place. Water supply and sanitation are in place. There is, nothing to be done in the future. But we wanted to really quantify what are these investment needs, also to attract the attention and to open the eyes of our policymaker on these needs because they are corresponding to fundamental services provided to the population. Having that said, we have also used, and we were intending to use this result for the evaluation of the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive. This directive regulates the collection and the treatment of wastewater in the European Union. And we were thinking that it was extremely important to have an idea of these investment needs before thinking of a revision of the directive. I will come back to that as well. And then also our colleague of DG Regio, in the European Union, we have a system where member states can have access to funding. And for the wastewater sector, it was a very important source of funding, particularly for those member states that joined the Union a little bit later in 2004. And the challenge for them was extremely important. It was really a huge challenge. And that's why we have in the European Union the possibility to access to European funds to support this transition and to support the implementation of our directive. But we wanted to have an objective idea of the quantification of the needs for each country, also to make sure that in the future funds are reserved to support these investments. Also, another thing on financing strategy, those member states have joined later the European Union. In some of those countries, the results were really impressive. They managed in a record time to build their infrastructure and to be compliant with the directive, whereas in some so-called older member states, they are still not compliant for some of them. So despite the fact that they had 20 years, I'm speaking really of a long period to be compliant. But we are in process with them and we put them in court when it's needed. But also we wanted to have a dialogue with the member states. And that's my last point as an introduction. A dialogue with the member states to really understand what are the constraints in those member states having big investment needs and limited possibilities of financing resource. And that's also why we organize together with OECD in the framework of this context, in the context of this project, 10 country visits, and with a lot of stakeholders and a lot of attention in each of these countries to have a dialogue, not to come with our, hat as a guardian of the treaty, but simply to have a dialogue of what are the challenges and how can we help also the member states to implement this legislation. I will stop here and I will come back 5 minutes after the presentation of Xavier to explain concretely how we have used the results. And by the way, while I'm speaking, 1 hour ago, our president has just finished a press conference on the recovery fund, and I will come back to that after Xavier's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Michel. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm going to share my screen to go with you, to go through some of the main messages that derive from the report. It's my privilege to share the results with you today, but I must say that it is really a team effort and a team from the European Commission, a team from the OECD, but also a number of experts and policymakers from member states have joined. So I really encourage you to go through the acknowledgement section of the report because it really matters. It really makes sense. So the key topics I would like to share with you today: first, clarification and scope of the project. Share with you some key elements of the process so that you understand how we've worked. A note on method. There are a number of caveats because although we are very fortunate in Europe, working with the European Commission to have access to very strong and robust data compared to other parts of the world, there are still a number of caveats and massive things that we don't know. So I would like to highlight them. And then come to the crux of the matter and share some of the key data that derive from our work on current level of expenditure, so on projected financing needs. And then we will be able to discuss some of the, clarify or assess the financing capacities of EU member states and explore some options to bridge the gap. So very quickly, the idea is not just to produce data, but to be policy relevant. So the ambition here is to identify the countries which are facing the most severe financing challenges to comply with the EU acquis, especially the Drinking Water Directive, Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, and the Flood Directive. Explore policy options to bridge the gap at national level, but also see how institutions like the European Commission can also provide support. As I said, we focused on water supply, sanitation, and flood protection. Today, I won't have much to say on flood protection for many reasons, but the relevant data is available in the report. In terms of process, we spent quite some time to build the evidence, so characterize the current levels of expenditure, project investment needs, and assess financing capacities. So this has been an important part of the work to come with robust facts and robust data on which to base policy discussions. Then we really wanted to engage with the countries and have concrete discussion to substantiate the policy options. That's why with the European Commission, we organized 9 country workshops in countries which are facing some of the most severe financing challenges. We also had 2 regional workshops in Brussels, one at one fairly early in the process and one in December, where we shared results with the countries and invited countries to comment and provide additional information or feedback. And we also engaged with the OECD community, the Working Party on Biodiversity, Water and Ecosystems, which was invited to comment both on the analysis and the policy recommendations. Today, we are able to launch a set of outputs. There is 1 report, but there are also 9 reports on the country workshops that I mentioned, and 28 country fact sheets that bring together in a short and concise way some of the key facts that we collected on each member state. A short note here on UK, I have to be specific. We covered 28 EU member states because most of the work was done over the last 2 years. I mean, all the work was done over the last 2 years before Brexit. So that's why EU figures here cover 28 member states, including UK, and UK features among the countries that were analyzed. A couple of messages on method, because I think that really matters. We really spent a lot of time trying to collect data that will allow us to benchmark countries among others. So I suspect on each of these dimensions, there are other sources of information. So in one particular country, experts may be able to come up with different figures, but really the emphasis here was to have robust figures that are comparable across countries. So that was an important point in the method that was designed. Then we, on the basis of that data, we constructed what we call a baseline. So we tried to report on actual expenditures spent by the countries on water supply and sanitation. And then we explored a number of scenarios to project financing needs. One was business as usual, essentially driven by urbanization and population growth. Another one driven by compliance, so minimizing the distance to compliance to the drinking water and urban wastewater treatment directive. On drinking water, most countries are already very close to compliance, if not in full compliance. But we thought we could add another layer of difficulty or stringency here by assuming that inefficient management of water services are not an option. They are not. It's not sustainable. So we assume that countries would converge towards a particular threshold for leakage for drinking water. In the report, we explored two thresholds: 10% of leakage or 20% of leakage, which may be more realistic. The figures that I'm going to share today are based on the most stringent threshold. We fully agree that this is an arbitrary threshold. It is not to be found anywhere in the EU or OECD, and in the EU regulation or OECD rhetoric on water supply. Still, we think it's an important, interesting addition for countries who want to manage water in a sustainable way. A quick note on the caveats, on the things we don't know. I think the elephant in the room is the state of existing assets. In essence, we don't know what's the state of water supply and sanitation networks in the countries. Euro, which is probably the best placed organization to collect that data, is able to share information, but about only half of the countries that, half of Euro members are able to report on the state of existing assets. And obviously this can have massive consequences on future investment needs. And that's typically where countries individually may be able to have access to robust information, but there is no way, we couldn't find any way to have comparable information on this, and particularly on investment backlogs across EU member states. One very difficult issue is the baseline for flood protection. In essence, we don't know how much countries spend on flood protection. Some countries provide robust information, but there is no way that information can be compared across countries. So that's why for flood protection, we've done all the similar work that I'm going to share on water supply and sanitation, but we're not able to monetize investment needs for flood protection. You'll have more explanation in the report. Things which are not captured in this report are expenditures to comply with the Water Framework Directive. So typically, countries can be in line with the Drinking Water and Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, but still be lagging behind on compliance with the Water Framework Directive. And so this requires additional work, not covered into this research. And in addition, we acknowledge that there will be additional drivers for future investment needs, typically related to sludge management, to contaminants of emerging concern, or to additional adaptation to climate change. In the report, we're able to discuss these additional drivers in a qualitative way, but not able to monetize them. Now, looking at the baseline, so what's the current level of expenditure for water supply and sanitation across the EU? An aggregate figure suggests that countries in aggregate spend roughly 100 billion euro per year on water supply and sanitation. And almost 90% of that is being spent by the so-called EU 15 countries. As Michel suggested, this is not an apt characterization of the split between countries, but that's one which is quite practical, so we used it here. Maybe more interesting is to see how countries spend per capita. So it's the same data, but per capita. Luxembourg is on its own league for a number of reasons. One is the number of people who work and live in Luxembourg, who work in Luxembourg but don't live there. So they don't qualify as inhabitants, but they are still water users in Luxembourg. And that's explained why per capita figures in Luxembourg are quite out of range. Here you see the wide spectrum of per capita expenditure for water supply and sanitation per country, with huge differences between the Netherlands and Ireland or Germany on the one hand, and Lithuania, Bulgaria, and Romania at the other end of the spectrum. You can already anticipate that if a country like Romania spends 50 euro per year per person, that may not be enough to cover operation and maintenance costs, not to mention investment costs. This chart is another way to plot or to assess the level of effort that countries are putting into water supply and sanitation. On the horizontal axis, you have per capita expenditure, and on the vertical axis gives you the share of GDP allocated to water supply and sanitation expenditure. And typically on the left-hand side of the chart, you will see countries like Bulgaria, Croatia, or Romania, although they spend comparatively little in terms of expenditure per capita, at an aggregate level, it still represents a comparatively high share of GDP, meaning that it may be difficult for these countries to put more money into water supply and sanitation. At the other end of the spectrum, you see countries like Slovenia or Cyprus, which are already putting a lot of money, both per capita and as a share of GDP, into water supply and sanitation. So one question here would be to see whether that money is spent wisely if you take into account their performance in terms of compliance with the EU acquis. Now, if we move to projected financing needs, this chart reflects the three scenarios that I mentioned. So the business as usual, that's the blue bar. Compliance with the water supply, so compliance and efficiency with for water supply, that's the orange bar, and compliance with the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, that's the gray bar. There are, I think, a few interesting messages here. Most countries would have to spend more than 400 euros per person in addition to what they already spend to comply with the two directives that we focused on. At the same time, you can see that countries, that these additional expenditure will be driven by different drivers. In countries like Ireland or Netherlands, an important driver will be urbanization and the rise in urban population. But in most countries, compliance with the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive will be the main driver. This chart is compares projected financing needs with the current level of expenditure. And as Kathleen said in her introduction, all countries will have to spend more than 25%. They will have to increase their current level of expenditure by 25% or more. But countries like Bulgaria and Romania will have to multiply by 2 or more current level of expenditure. Most countries will have to increase current level of expenditure by 40%. And obviously you can imagine that that's not minor. And as Michel said, there is maybe some complacency across OECD and EU member states that, you know, water supply and sanitation is not such a big issue. We've done a lot of investments and we're almost there. If you think about future developments and future needs, being able to increase current level of expenditure by 20% or more will be a challenge, and that's not something that should be taken for granted. So then you have to wonder where the money comes from at the moment. On this chart, we compare countries on the basis of their reliance on revenues from water tariffs and public budgets. And you can see here there is, again, a very wide diversity in Europe. So we don't have household expenditure data for Sweden and Croatia. So, but for all the other countries, I mean, it's well known that in Ireland, the vast majority of the people don't pay a water bill, and taxpayers will cover the cost. At the other end of the spectrum, countries like Denmark in particular are really trying hard to cover all the costs of water supply and sanitation services through revenues from tariffs. So a wide range of spectrum. And I think that's an interesting information when we think about future financing strategies, and in particular, the additional pressure on public finance that can be anticipated in the current context. Here you will see, here we try to measure how much countries depend on funds provided by the European Commission. Michel mentioned the work of DG Regio, which has been a major source of support, financial support for a number of countries. And you can see that countries like Estonia and Romania, actually, almost all of the public spending came from EU funds. So that's when that money was properly used, that was smart. The point is that that dependency is a challenge because we know that this financial support from the European Commission is being phased out. So that will generate further challenges for countries which are heavily reliant or dependent on that source of funding. An interesting discussion is about the affordability of water supply and sanitation tariffs, because obviously one way to increase spending will be to generate additional revenues through water tariffs. On that chart, we try to, we assess the share of disposable income from households that is allocated to water supply and sanitation expenditure. And the red spot portrays the situation of the poorest 5% of the population in a country, and the orange one reflects the situation of the poorest 10%. The point here is that for 1/3 of EU member states, affordability is an issue for 5% of the population. But you can see the other side of the coin, which says that for 2/3 of these countries, affordability is not an issue in the sense that more than 90–95% of the population could spend more. So there is a risk actually that keeping water tariff below a certain level actually benefits people who could spend more and affects the financial sustainability of service providers. So I think that's interesting, an interesting input to a discussion on affordability. We're not saying that affordability is not an issue. We're saying here that it should not be overstated at an aggregate level. And the point here in terms of policy responses is that targeted policy responses may be more appropriate and effective than cheap water, to put it in a quite abrupt way. On this chart, I'm not going to go into the detail, but this chart actually synthesizes the previous results and rank countries according to the increased investment needs. So here, topping the leads, you have Romania and Bulgaria. And at the same time, we try to characterize the room for maneuver that these countries have to increase finance for water supply and sanitation. Just as an illustration here, you can see, look at Austria and Hungary. They face similar level of need to increase investment needs in the future. 42% in Hungary, 44% in Austria, but they are in very different situation in terms of capacities to finance these additional needs. Typically, Austria already allocates 0.5% of GDP to water supply and sanitation, which is half of what Hungary allocates. Austria has more room for maneuver to raise to raise tariffs or to access domestic debt than Hungary. So we use that information to characterize the situation of countries, to select countries that face the most severe challenges, and then to have more in-depth discussion and tailored discussion in these countries through the 9 country workshop that we already alluded to. So in summary, several countries spend comparatively little on water supply and sanitation. I already mentioned that. Whereas other countries allocate a significantly higher share of their GDP on water supply and sanitation. That can be a source of interest, fine. That can be also a source of concern if that level of investment doesn't translate into high level of compliance with the EU acquis. All countries will need to increase investment by at least 20% in the next few decades, in the next few years. Reliance of EU funding is an issue for some countries. Limited experience in most countries with other sources of finance, such as bank and commercial debt. And with the caveats I mentioned, household affordability is not a major constraint for a majority of countries. Now, if we think about policy options, and I'll be quite quick here, we would like to insist that this is not all about bringing more money into the water sector. I think the work shows that there are other dimensions or other avenues to be explored to bridge the financing gap. First, to make the best use of available water resources, avoiding wastage, making sure water is being properly and effectively allocated. So these are avoiding pollution at source, which is more cost effective than treating it downstream. Another dimension, another area, make the best use of existing assets. A lot can be done in improving the efficiency of water utilities and the way they are managed. Enhance investment decisions. We would like to make sure that money goes to projects which actually contribute to enhance or improved service on the ground and a number of benefits to the communities, including getting closer to compliance with the EU acquis. Put water on the radar of other sectors. I think this is critical to understand that water-related finance does not need to come from the water sector. I mean, smart urban design can do a long way in contributing to robust water supply and sanitation services without putting more pressure on water tariffs, for instance. And obviously harness new sources of finance. There are a number of options, especially in Europe, to mobilize private finance. That can be debt or different type of financiers who may have an interest in chipping in with the appropriate allocation of risks and revenues. I'll stop there for the sake of time, but we have more concrete options which are being discussed in the reports, and that may be that we could discuss maybe during the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Xavier. That was a very comprehensive and interesting presentation. We already have a number of questions coming through, but before we launch into the Q&A, I'd like to just turn it quickly back to Michel to make a few remarks about now that we have a better understanding of the results of the study, how they're actually being used at the Commission level and for member states. Michel?
Yes, thank you very much. I will try to be short. In fact, I have three main points to explain. Well, the first, as I was just already mentioning, you know, as we were speaking, the press conference of our President von der Leyen has just finished, and she announced a major recovery plan for the European Union of 750 billion euro, which is massive. But what is clear is that we managed to put there, you know, in a staff working document accompanying this recovery plan, a chapter on wastewater management and water management. And the data and the figures which are just published now today on the recovery plan are completely coming from the OECD study. So it's a direct input from the study in direct action from the European Union. And I think we can collectively be proud of that, because one of the fears that we had with the actual crisis on COVID was that most of the investment in public sector, and particularly in the water sector, could have been delayed. And because the priorities could have been changed. But in fact, with these European funds and the priority given to the Green Deal and to the sector of water, this will probably be avoided. And on the contrary, we hope to have additional funding to cover these investments which were identified in the OECD study. So that's one of the very concrete result of this study that we can just announce, and I'm really happy and proud of that. A second one, which is really important, is that we intend to review the urban wastewater treatment directive. This is a long old story, and the directive was adopted in 1991. So we think that there is now room to improve it, and we have also received the authorization a few days ago to launch an impact assessment to analyze different options to make this directive more modern and to make it fit for purpose. So amongst the remaining issues that we want to tackle, clearly there are some remaining sources of pollution. I'm thinking about stormwater overflows or little villages which are not covered by the directive. But there are also emerging issues like, you know, how to make sure that carbon neutrality could be reached in the midterm. Today, around 1% of the total European energy is devoted to the water sector, and particularly water supply and sanitation. And we would like, if we want to go to carbon neutrality, investment have to be made to reduce the use of energy in the sector, and as far as possible to produce energy also, for instance, from a better sludge management. Another issue is related to pharmaceuticals or micropollutants or microplastics. And there it leads also to another lesson that we have learned from these studies, that indeed we have to find additional source of financing. And one of these might be the use of a producer responsibility system. This system of producer responsibility are largely used in the solid waste sector. And we're thinking of developing something original in the context of our impact assessment to try to see whether this producer responsibility schemes could not be applied also in the water sector. Another lesson is that we have to pay attention to affordability. And affordability is really important. We have seen that in some countries, there is an issue with the low income, and that increasing the water price in these countries could face an obstacle, a clear obstacle of social difficulties. There, I think we have to learn from countries having managed to keep high social protection while having increased at the same time water price. And there are a few examples coming from the study that we can use and organize exchange of best practice on social tariff, for instance, or how to tackle and to manage this problem. Xavier mentioned that European money through regional funds will probably decrease. I think it's one of the challenges of the sector is to make it sustainable in the future from the financial point of view. But that would mean increase in the water price, and that's where affordability is really important. We will look at that also in the impact assessment that we are launching now. We are also going to use the results with DG Regio because with DG Regio now access to European money will be conditional to some condition, and it's named enabling condition. And amongst those conditions, improved governance is one important thing. So meaning that European money will be accessible only in those member states having a clear identification of their investment needs, a clear identification of the priorities for investment, and also a financing strategy which is solid. And I will just close with that by explaining that we intend to follow up with the OECD. We have a new phase of continuation of the joint cooperation, which will focus on a better assessment of the benefits of the water sector. We all know what are the costs, but it's quite more difficult to have an idea of the benefits. And so far, the methodologies to quantify the benefits are relatively limited. And another thing that we will continue, apart from another assessment of the investment needs for the other sector in the water, for floods and for the Water Framework Directive, we also intend to reorganize some regional workshops involving different countries facing the same problem to continue this dialogue and this exchange of best practice. And I will stop with that. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you very much, Michel, for adding those few points. It's so good to already hear that there is very concrete impacts and next steps related to the findings. Now, we really want to move into the Q&A here, and we may extend a little bit beyond the hour, just because we have limited time and a number of good questions coming in, so thank you for those. I would encourage you to continue to provide questions via the chat. We will try to get to as many as possible. We may not be able to get to them all, but what I'll probably do also is group those questions together a little bit. So we've had a couple of questions coming in really around also the scope of the study. So the focus here is mainly on the water supply and sanitation, flood protection, but a couple of people have asked how are the financing needs related to the water framework directly more broadly considered in the study, if they are at all. Of course, considering that just meeting the urban wastewater treatment directive requirements are not sufficient to get to good status water bodies. And a little bit along those lines as well, if you could say some words about the extent to which additional investments due to pollutants, emerging pollutants and sludge management, how they might have been accounted for, what could be expected from the study. So I'll give those two questions really about scope to you, Xavier and Michel, but we have many more questions, so I just suggest short answers if possible.
Well, very quickly, these are very interesting but also challenging questions. As regards the Water Framework Directive, I think from a financing perspective, the Water Framework Directive raises very different issues. So we were not able to capture them in the same methodology, the same project. In this report, we discuss, we approach it from the perspective of policy coherence and how policies that are put in place at national level to comply with the drinking and the urban wastewater treatment directive contribute to compliance with or alignment with the ambition of the Water Framework Directive, because it's not a done deal. Sometimes you will see initiatives on drinking water or urban wastewater which can actually be detrimental to the good status of water bodies. So that's how we approach that in the report. But we are doing in parallel. We are working also with DG Environment on the economics of the Water Framework Directive, because I think there are also some similarities when you in terms of the efficiency of public expenditure programs, policy coherence, and the possibility to harness new sources of finance, typically to most systematically implement the polluter pays principle. That can be a major driver for compliance with the Water Framework Directive. When it comes to contaminants of emerging concern, so again, we approach that in a qualitative way because there is very little information that can support a quantitative or monetized discussion here. Still, in the report, we analyzed the Swiss approach because Switzerland is the first country probably to have in place a national strategy to address pharmaceuticals residues in freshwater. So we analyzed the freshwater, and just for the, to support the discussion or to kickstart the discussion, we simulated what if this approach was replicated across Europe. So for each EU member state, you will see an assessment of additional costs to deal with contaminants of emerging concern if these countries were to replicate the approach put in place by Switzerland. We're not saying this is the best approach or the only one, but just to give an idea, an order of magnitude on these issues.
Okay, thank you. It's already very complete, but what I can add is that for the urban wastewater and the relation with the Water Framework Directive, which is really an important question, this will be definitely analyzed also in the impact assessment that we are launching now. We want to make sure that these two directives are even more coherent. I think they are very coherent, but probably we have to think about a system to adapt the level of treatment of the urban wastewater treatment directive to the requirements of the good ecological status from the Water Framework Directive. Having that said, one of the beauty of this urban wastewater directive is that it's relatively simple and clear, and we would like to preserve this clarity. Member states know what they have to do. They have an objective, they have deadline, clear deadline, and we have a system of monitoring which is functioning. And so between these two constraints, we will analyze different options in the impact assessment. Same as for the pharmaceuticals. Indeed, we discussed with OECD and Xavier how to project, the needs for pollutants of emerging concerns on the basis of the Swiss example. But probably we will go for another option, which will be more a risk-based approach, and to make sure that the investments are made where it makes sense and not in a kind of horizontal way everywhere. But all these options will be presented and discussed in the context of the impact assessment, and we will have a large public consultation on these different options, and we will assess the cost and the benefits of each of these options. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you so much. So two other questions. One I'm going to give this to Xavier first, and then I have a question directed more toward you, Michelle. I'm going to give you both those questions right now. You can think about them. The first question, Xavier, directed at you is from Franz Rojas from CAF. And he really appreciated this message that this discussion is not just all about more money, but very much also brings attention to the fact that a strong enabling environment is needed. Could you say some more about the enabling environment and how that is connected to this work on investment and financing, especially with regard to the role of regulation to promote investment and to ensure quality standards? So that's a question to you, Xavier. And for you, Michelle, we have a question from Anna Albuquerque, and she's asking really about what is the criteria that would taken into account in the allocation of EU funds going forward. And the question here is, would the results of the investments undertaken in the past by each country be considered, or is it more a focus on allocating funds based on the need of additional investments? And she highlights this as an important point to assure the quality of investments and that investments actually deliver the benefits intended. So some reflections on that point would be great, but I turn it to you, Xavier.
How much time do we have? Because this well, I take the opportunity first to thank Franz for a very topical question, but also to refer to more OECD work on financing water that Kathleen in particular is spearheading, which is very much focused on that, the enabling environment that can stimulate and accelerate investment for water supply and sanitation services, but for water management and water policies more generally. So I really encourage you to visit our webpage, www.oecd.org/water, and you will have much more information, typically if you look at the work of the roundtable on financing water. For the sake of brevity here, I would like to flag two things on this enabling environment. First, we see a lot of value being an economic organization into the role of economic regulation, which can set a number of incentives to enhance the performance of service providers, to put in place economic policy instruments, tariff charges, or other instruments that can be that can significantly contribute to bridging the financing gap. And also, I would like to emphasize a point raised by Michel earlier when he spoke about enabling conditions. I think there is a great avenue here. I mean, an opportunity to really drive reform in countries to make sure that money will be used wisely. This issue, I mean, the fact that 1 out of 2 EU member states don't know the state of the assets. So they don't know if the current level of effort is up to the challenge, and they don't know whether there is a backlog in investment. That's, I mean, it's very difficult to come up with robust policy options and financing strategies if you don't have precise information on the state of the asset. So typically, enabling conditions which can provide, which would somehow condition access to international support, in the case of CAF, for instance, to countries which were able to provide robust information on the state of the assets. Because if you don't have that in place, it's very unlikely that you will have a robust financing strategy. So I think much more work could be done on these enabling conditions, not to create hurdles, not to create obstacles, but to put in place incentives for countries to make sure that the money that will be allocated will be spent wisely and in an effective way to projects that will deliver on the ground.
Yes, and on my side, I think what Xavier mentioned is really important, and you know, the criteria for allocation of funds will take that into account for the new programming period. These enabling conditions are exactly related to the quality of the investment plan and the financing strategy of each of the country asking for having access to the European funds. Obviously, our colleagues of DG Regio are in the lead there. I'm not a specialist of that, but through the study, we managed also to identify those countries having big investment needs with limited possibilities to use their own budget because of the macroeconomic conditions, and limited possibilities to still increase the price of water without taking hard action on the social level to avoid that the low income are really meeting difficulties. So again, that's a direct benefit of this study. And just to answer, there are a lot of criteria to have access to this European money. You know, they are designed in and included in a regulation which was adopted for the use of the European funds. So all that is accessible from the ad hoc website. But you know, there is not only one criteria. Probably this study will help us to drive the investment where it makes sense.
Excellent, thank you so much. And we have a number of really excellent questions coming in. And I do apologize because I realize we won't be able to get to all of them, but we will continue the discussion for another 10 minutes past the hour. And let me group another 2 questions together for you to consider this, not necessarily connected, but for you to respond to at the same time. Just to save time here. One is a question, you know, at the end of your presentation, Xavier, you mentioned really a need to look at mobilizing new sources of finance. That includes commercial capital, but really that's been done to a very limited extent in the European context. So we have one participant who's asking, well, what are really the concrete options to attract commercial funding in the sector? And are there some good examples that countries can take from other countries that they could potentially adopt and adapt to their own circumstances? So that's a question around commercial finance, the role that it can play. Then a broader question is really, you know, thinking about the current context. I think it's hard for us to escape the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting economic and social consequences are on the top of everyone's mind, certainly as many of us are dialing in from home and dealing with this in our daily work. And so one question, actually several participants have asked this question, but just to get your views around how this impact of the pandemic and the resulting economic consequences could impact this discussion on financing water. Of course, the study was done before that, But we recognize that there is increasing tensions on the economic and financial sustainability of the sector. What are your views on the extent to which countries will be able to adapt and respond? And do you foresee potentially some forms of specific financial support going into the sector? So that's, of course, just an open-ended question for you both.
Michel, or should I start?
Oh, please, Xavier.
Thank you. Well, on finance, what I'd like to flag is that the conversation has changed over the last decade or the last few years. When I started working on water, when we were talking about, that was quite a long time ago actually, when we were talking about financing, private finance, we were talking about utilities and private service providers. We now understand that private finance actually means a much wider range of private sources of finance. Michel already alluded to polluters. Typically, pharmaceutical industry, when they put new drugs on the market, they may be held accountable for the impact of these drugs on the cost of urban wastewater collection and treatment. And a scheme like an extended producer's responsibility can be a good way to actually harness new sources of finance. Property developers, they are typically people who benefit from secured access to water, secured access to a reliable sanitation, and so because these services add value to their property. So in a way, it would make sense that they contribute to foot the bill, which hasn't been the case usually. And if you think about typical commercial finance like banks, I was very interested in a country like Lithuania, for instance, where when we had a dedicated workshop, and there was a representative of commercial banks in Lithuania saying, we're interested, we would like to chip in, but we have to have a more in-depth discussion with the utilities and the municipalities to see how projects can be designed in such a way that they are attractive for commercial banks in Lithuania. We see a lot of value in that kind of discussion, and if countries could engage in more specific conversation on how to engage with domestic commercial finance, I think there is that can be a very fruitful avenue. And if a country like Lithuania is able to explore that, if domestic banks in Lithuania are looking to water supply and sanitation as a business opportunity, I'm sure that can be, the sector can be attractive for other countries in Europe. So obviously no blanket measure here, but I think tailored discussion at country level between project owners and commercial finance can be very fruitful. At the OECD, we try to support that kind of conversation through the roundtable on financing water, and we'd be happy to support that kind of discussion further.
Okay, on the crisis and COVID-19, I think I was already mentioning that money is clearly earmarked in the staff working document accompanying the strategy, which is published today. You can Google it, and you will find it really easily on the web. And if you go there, you will see that 30 billion per year are reserved for wastewater, for the sector of wastewater, which is an extension of the data that were collected by OECD, and 20 additional billion per year are reserved for water management. So it means a total availability of funds of European money to pass this crisis of 50 billion per year for the water sector, which is really significant, And again, I think this was made possible because we had a good assessment of the need. I think that said, that's only the first, and I would say not easier, but easy part of the picture. It's absolutely clear that you could have all the money of the world if the projects are not mature enough. We will not be in a position to spend this money, and that's probably one of the important challenge of the sector. probably we will have to have discussion in the coming weeks. We will have discussion in the coming weeks with all the colleagues involved in the spending of these funds. And we'll have to develop mechanisms at European level to make sure that these funds are used in the right way, in a sense. And that will be challenging for all of us because there is always a tension between how to make sure that the European money are well used and how to make sure that enough major projects and clever projects are on the table. I think that, one of the lessons of all these dialogues and with all this effort that we have done is that governance remains absolutely essential. And we have seen different levels of performance of water operators amongst the European Union. And we are of advice that we have also to support we have a support service specifically for that in the European Union, to support water reform in some countries where the water sector still needs to increase and improve its performance. So all that goes together, and probably, but to answer precisely on the COVID-19, I think we at European level will make sure that enough money will be available, at least from the public side. Now the challenge is to use this money, as I was mentioning. And by the way, just to finish with that, the crisis has also shown that the wastewater sector could be a good indicator to track and to prevent the pandemic, because we find this COVID-19 and the virus in the wastewater. And we have launched another project. But should this project show the feasibility of tracking COVID in the wastewater as a good management and surveillance management of the pandemic, then it will attract a lot of attention to the sector as well. But that's a parenthesis.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. And Xavier, I know that you wanted to come back in maybe quickly on that topic, but let me just throw in perhaps a last question from one of the private investors who's been engaged in the roundtable on financing water, which actually builds a bit on both of your responses to those previous questions. And question there is, is there an opportunity for EU funds or public funds at member state level to be used in a strategic way to then crowd in and perhaps mobilize some commercial sources of finance? This is what we call at OECD blended finance in the developing country context, but of course the principle applies for advanced and emerging economies as well. So any quick maybe reactions, if there is a potential to use these public funds that are going to go into this sector also in a strategic way to mobilize additional finance, that'd be great to hear. But Xavier, you also, I think, wanted to complement the response.
Well, that was actually the point I was willing to make. The discussion about public finance has changed also over the last few years. Public finance was usually considered as the first best option and has been used in such a way that it has somehow crowded out private finance because project owners, municipalities were considering that, well, if I can have access to public finance, why would I look for additional sources of finance? I think the conversation has shifted now because we understand that public finance will never be available at the scale that is needed. And I think the work on blended finance helps us better understand how public finance can be used strategically to cover some of the risks that private finance is not willing or able to take. And so with an appropriate allocation of risks and revenues, the same projects can use a smaller share of public finance and attract private finance in addition. So I think and typically the work that is being done under the Roundtable on Financing Water is very much on these issues. And I have to promote the work done by Kathleen. Recently, there is an OECD report on blended finance for water supply and sanitation that is exactly on this topic. But I think in essence, we understand the principle, how to use public finance. And that can be domestic public finance, just as in Europe, cohesion funds, or in other countries, development finance. How to use public finance to cover some specific risks, so they risk some of the part of the projects, and then attract private finance. I think this is a very fruitful conversation and one that needs to continue in different contexts. We had a question from Latin America. I think this is another terrain where blended finance can be very useful, but we'll also like to explore how that can work in Europe.
Thank you, Xavier, and thank you also, Michelle, for your very extensive comments and responses to all of these questions. We're now 10 minutes over time, and I'm going to have to wrap up the conversation, but I really want to thank, of course, our speakers and all of the participants for your time and attention. Obviously, this is just kickstarting, I think, a longer discussion that we can continue to pursue outside of the confines of this webinar. But I wanted to let you know that, of course, this webinar has been recorded, and that recording will be available in the coming days. And then let me also just remind you that this report has just been released today. And so there's a lot more detail and interesting findings and data inside of that report. So we really do encourage you to download that and delve deeper into those topics. And of course, we'll be continuing to work on these issues in partnership with the European Commission, but then also in the context of the Roundtable on Financing Water. So we look forward to continuing to engage with you all on these issues. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you again and goodbye.